Part of what I think is so important about celebrating commemorative months like Black History Month is that they act as the beginning of the conversation, not the end. This is a great way to get people engaged around really important issues and interests within the Black community. And I think people are going to be really impressed with the diversity of films and events and the ease of access. We've worked really hard to make this a really accessible program. All of our events will be available on our MKE Film Facebook page, our Black Lens Facebook page, and our MKE Film YouTube page. So you can go to either of those pages and watch events for free. Our films will be available on our watchmkefilm.org page from February 1st through February 28th.
Welcome, everybody. Welcome to Day 8 of Milwaukee Film's Black History Month program presented by Molson Coors. I am Tiana, Community Outreach Coordinator for Black Lens. For the month of February, Milwaukee Film is dedicating its new programming to films and events that celebrate, honor, and elevate Black culture and traditions. Engage with 30 films and a dozen events that inspire conversation, celebration, and community. Visit mkefilm.org/BHM for more information and to purchase tickets and passes. Welcome. I'm super excited about this conversation, y'all. Welcome to Pleasure Politics, a conversation about the persistent narratives about Black female sexuality, intimacy, and joy, which features 3 extraordinary scholars. So it is my honor to introduce Dr. Treva Lindsey, Associate Professor of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at The Ohio State University. Dr. Lindsey's research and teaching interests include African American women's history, Black popular culture, Black feminisms, and critical race and gender theory. Her book, Colored No More, Reinventing Black Womanhood in Washington, D.C., is a Choice 2017 Outstanding Academic Title. She is currently completing her next book, tentatively titled American Goddamn: Violence, Black Women, and the Struggle for Justice. She is the recipient of several awards and fellowships, among from the Woodrow Wilson Foundation, the Social Science Research Council, and the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. Dr. Lindsey contributes to outlets such as Al Jazeera, Time, Billboard, Bustle, Miss Magazine, The Washington Post, Women's Media Center, Zora, and Cosmopolitan. And next to the stage is Dr. Joan Morgan, Program Director for the Institute of African American Affairs and Center for Black Visual Culture, New York University. Dr. Morgan is an award-winning cultural critic, feminist author, and a pioneering hip-hop journalist. Morgan coined the term hip-hop feminism in 1999 when she published the groundbreaking book, When Chicken Heads Come Home to Roost, A Hip-Hop Feminist Breaks It Down, which is taught at universities globally. Regarded internationally as an expert on the topics of hip-hop, race, and gender, Morgan has made numerous television and radio appearances. She has been a visiting scholar at the New School, Vanderbilt, and Duke, and Stanford University, and is currently the program director at New York University's Institute of African American Affairs and Center for Black Visual Culture. Out of her academic work, which interrogates Black feminist theories, historical scripting of Black female sexuality through the lens of a pleasure politic, she founded the Pleasure Ninjas Collective. In her most recent book is She Begat This, 20 Years of the Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. Jamaican-born and South Bronx bred, Dr. Morgan is a proud native New Yorker. And finally, our moderator for the evening will be Dr. Shoniqua Roach, Assistant Professor of African Studies and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Brandeis University. Dr. Roach's research focused on the relationship between Black feminist aesthetics and politics, specifically the ways in which post-slavery Black feminist theory and cultural productions expose ongoing anti-Black spatial, social, and political regimes, as well as imagine and enact spatial, social, and political alternatives to them. Currently, she is working on her book manuscript project, provisionally titled Black Dwelling, which historicizes and theorizes Black feminist writings and representations of the home and domesticity as counterintuitive sites of Black liberation and erotic potential. Y'all enjoy this conversation. Make sure you engage the chat And I'll turn it over to Dr. Roach. Thank you.
Thank you so very much. Today, I have the distinct pleasure and honor of moderating a conversation between some of the most brilliant Black feminists, pleasure activists, and scholars and beyond in the game. Super excited. Event structure, we'll talk for roughly 50 minutes, 50 that is, and then pivot to Q&A. Let's get started. So, what is pleasure? How do you know it when you see it, feel it, hear it, smell it, touch it?
I'll start. And the thing that I love about that question is that I think pleasure is when that question doesn't even enter into your mind. I think that, it is really the peaceful and joyful space of knowing that you are enjoying something without having to provide an intellectual analysis or response of what is it that I'm feeling right now. I think of pleasure space as free space, a free time of healing space, as joy space. And I actually think if you have to think about it too much, it's probably not as pleasurable as it should be.
I hear that.
I would agree. There's something just very visceral about pleasure when you're experiencing it. And that part of you that I hate, that's why I hate the term guilty pleasure, because it's like, why are we assigning guilt to the things that give us that visceral feeling and that quiet ecstasy that moves from the inside and burns in and up and out and is convivial and has these moments of that you suspend some of that should I not, and overthinking of the moment, which doesn't mean that it can't be thoughtful or intentional, but meaning that if, as Dr. Morgan said, if you're sitting there like, well, I don't know, is this really, can I do all of this? You've already talked yourself out of pleasure. You've already kind of removed yourself from the possibility of feeling the fullness of what pleasure means.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I'd love to hear more about your individual and collective pleasure journeys. As Black women, as Black feminists, as Black feminist collaborators, as part of the wonderful Pleasure Ninjas, could you historicize your journeys for us a little bit?
So the Pleasure Ninjas came about, I was in grad school at NYU, and I actually was doing a completely different project. But I was faced with the dilemma of my Black feminist public intellectual work was completely removed from the project that I was doing scholarly, and I just felt divided in a very unpleasurable kind of way. But what kept coming up for me as someone who's explored the space of hip hop and its grays, and interrogated it through my work in hip hop feminism, I really, I love gray space, and I really was struck by the increasing amount of cultural criticism that we did on Black women's cultural products that always started as a problem, right? Like the term hypersexual was used all the time, and we had no language for what was just purely sexual. Right? We had no language to describe what was an erotic engagement. We weren't talking about erotic mapping. Like we weren't talking really about sex other than it being a problem. And so I started to wonder what opens up in our understanding of ourselves, in our very humanity, if we start to look at these cultural producers and their engagements through the lens of pleasure, not negating, Black women's sexuality that is rooted in a logic of trauma and exploitation and racialized sexual abuse. And that's the legacy of the transatlantic slave trade. But I also know that that is not all of who we are. And there just seemed to be a complete distance between the pleasurable experiences I was having with my Black women friends as we, I don't know, listen to a Beyonce, or when I'm dirty whining, or when I am listening to, you know, Gregory Isaacs' Night Nurse. Like, that seemed to be in a completely different and in some way unlanguageable space from what I was engaging in, what was supposed to be Black feminist cultural critique. And so I really did an exploration of that could close the gap. I was fortunate enough to be teaching at Stanford. I had a committee that was really gracious when I was like, can I go teach at Stanford? And come back to my comps, y'all good? And one of the things that I asked Stanford was to just give me some funding so that I could establish the Pleasure Ninjas. And I flew Brittany Cooper, Dr. Treva Lindsey, Dr. Cooper, Esther Arma, and Dr. Kyla Story out. And we basically brainstormed pleasure for like a week. And we also went salsa dancing and ate really good food and had massages. And I wanted to see what happens when you theorize from a very holistic space. But, you know, as importantly, we really made a commitment to keep pleasure in the forefront of our individually scholarly integrations and interrogations, and to just kind of see what happens.
It's beautiful. Dr. Lindsey?
Yes, it was such an incredible experience to be part of that, to be invited to be a part of that. As at the point at which she was asking, I was just starting to make this pivot in certain ways towards violence as the central part of my work. And I've been asking questions around pleasure and movement and body. My background is as a dancer. And so being in my body and being evocative with my body, being expressive with my body, meant a lot to my practice as both a scholar and just a person moving through the world. And a piece that I wrote with Jessica Marie Johnson, which comes a little bit after the founding of the Pleasure Ninjas, the establishment of it, by Dr. Morgan, we were like, if we look back in slavery, what do we see? If we look back at these moments only read through the lens, as you mentioned, of a logic of terror, a logic of trauma, a logic of injury, aren't we doing that same thing of evacuating sensation and feeling and connection of our foremothers? And it seemed to us that there was something missing in that. And so coming to the Pleasure Ninjas gave me voice, emboldened me, I should say, to take that a step farther, and gave me a space as I was moving through incredible archives of pain and trauma to not reduce Black women and femmes of past generations to that trauma. That felt like allowing white supremacy and heteropatriarchy to even embed itself and predominate how I understood Black women's lived experiences. It's one thing to think about the structural realities of existing in a racist, sexist, anti-Black, colonialist, etc. society. It's another thing to think about the ways that people navigate that and center themselves in their relationships and their intimacies and their erotic possibilities in terms of doing that. And so the Pleasure Ninjas became this incredible collective, collaborative, feminist space with which to think out loud about this and collaborate and join with sister scholars who were also like, where is the pleasure? Where is the pleasure in what we do? Where is the pleasure in how we move? Where's the pleasure in the work that we do? And what Dr. Morgan established with that Stanford convening was that this work can feel good.
Absolutely.
The work can feel good.
Can you both tell us a bit about the impediments, if any, that you face to getting Pleasure Ninjas off of the ground, to producing some of the brilliant Black feminist scholarship on pleasure that you produced thus far, even impediments to navigating academic and other spaces from a pleasure-centered standpoint perspective?
Well, yeah, there was definitely resistance, to say the least. You know, I think it's a couple of things. I think that I I was admittedly very privileged to be able to start the Pleasure Ninjas. I mean, most grad students can't do what I did, right? Like you don't have the opportunity to go teach as a visiting at Stanford during your grad school year. It also gives you a little bit of leverage with a committee, which my committee at NYU is fantastic. But I also, I also have a committee. My committee is entirely feminist and of color. And also, Dr. Deb Willis is an artist and also on my committee. So she has great stakes in pleasure. So I had a lot of support. And I also was able to have the resources to pull this convening together. But part of the reason that I did it is because I do believe that Black feminist work done in collaboration can be really powerful work. But I also knew like the pushback that we would be getting required, like you needed your girls, you needed support for sure. And so I got all kind of warnings when I announced that I was doing this work, to make sure that we were, mostly from men, from Black men, just make sure you're being responsible. As if Black women in like centering their pleasure is an abdication of your role as caretaker in the community, right? Like, no one ever says to Black men in the history of Black manhood ever, be responsible about about pleasure, right? We got asked, accused all the time of like pleasure being a neoliberal project. Now, again, to your first question, if you are already putting pleasure and neoliberalism together, you are stepping far away from like pleasure. And also, pleasure politics has a certain kind of emergence, I think, in the Black feminist and cultural conversation in the last, 7 to 10 years. But this is also, when Black female historians talk about enslaved Black women, and they talk about the multiple bodies, right, that they used to navigate slavery, the body that belonged to dance and to gathering, the body that showed up to do the labor, the body that existed in intimate kind of relationships. Those divisions of body are actually strategies, right, to access and navigate pleasure. So I was really interested in what my dissertation allowed me to do is to make the links between these different kinds of works and, kind of call out a quite frankly, what I think had become just a laziness in over-relying on Patricia Hill Collins and in some ways Audre Lorde to sort of do a dismissive read of Black female representations. And so, some of us really do treat Black feminist theory as theology and not theory, as if like, how dare you question what has come before. And that's not how theory works. Like, you build on theory, you challenge theory. We do it in all other areas. And I think that we do our foremothers a real insult when we assume that they don't expect us to take the work and value it and respect it seriously enough that we would do these reintegrations. So, bullshit came from all sides, to be like, quite frank with you.
Right. Thank you.
Yes, I would co-sign that. Basically, it was interesting. Most of us at the time, all of us. I think one of our folks was going through, who were in the academy at the one time, was going through tenure at the time we founded it. But the rest of us who were in the academy were untenured, and there was concern from folks about what it would mean, not just to focus on pleasure, which I think is important, but double down on work that was collaborative, right? Because the institution privileges the individual. What are your single authored publications? What is your specific intervention? And I was really grateful for the practice, right? So there's theorizing pleasure in this, and theory is method as well, but thinking about the practice of pleasure and the practice of doing collaborative work, which as a Black feminist, I feel is fundamental to how I envision doing a lot of work. I think about the conversations that Chandra Mahanti and MJ Alexander used to have at the National Women's Studies Association meeting, talking about the collaborative CV and what it means to build with each other, to be generative with each other, to be in conversation with one's ancestors, which essentially, and progenitors, which is essentially talking back to folks who've talked about pleasure in the past, or the limited ways people talked about pleasure in the past. That's also a collaborative work, right? Absolutely. Citation as practice is a collaborative endeavor.
Absolutely.
And I say that Black feminist pleasure is no different from that kind of endeavor, but I think it acutely has to be aware of what it means to roll with crew to do it and to interrogate. And I know my work is sharper. I know my work is better, because I'm thinking with this analytic, and I'm thinking and moving with that practice as I do the work, especially when I write about violence, right? Because it's a reminder to me that although I'm writing about some of the worst instances of the racialized, sexualized, gendered terror that confronts Black women, girls, and femmes, that part of while I'm writing this is for the possibility that more of us can experience pleasure, and that there aren't all these barriers that are put in place.
Absolutely.
So frontier that it approaches, as much as it is a lived reality of how Black women and femmes navigate, as well as the possibilities therein. So I want to fight for a world like that has pleasure everywhere. Right? I want an abundance of it, right?
Absolutely. I love that, and love that the pleasure ninjas prioritize that kind of Black sistership, that crewship. Like, as Dr. Morgan said, it's like I had to bring the girls out. Can you speak a bit more?
In every way, you got to bring the girls out when it comes to you really got to. That crew thing matters. I mean, it's not that I don't think any of us singularly can't do and be bold in the academy, but why, as a Black feminist practice, do you think you need to go at it alone? What about it tells us that going at it alone is more generative, is more dynamic, is more impassioned, is more committed to justice? A just project is in and of itself a collaborative project as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Could y'all talk a bit more about strategies that you've employed to collectivize Black women's pleasure, Black feminist pleasure? Dr. Morgan, that was a brilliant convening. And you spoke to some of the, I guess, material privileges you had access to that enabled you to form the Pleasure Ninjas, to get the funding, to be at Stanford, et cetera. What advice would you give to folk who are wanting to mount, collective and collectivist Black feminist pleasure projects, perhaps with fewer resources?
I think ultimately the great thing about this for me is that it stems in conversations, right? And while it was really lovely to be able to have everyone out in the beautiful Bay Area, and the massages were great and the food was wonderful, that's just like my extra shit. Like that's the icing on, the cake. But I mean, in theory, right, we could have done this over Zoom calls, and the work doesn't always come out of like workspace. It also comes out of play space, right? Like we've become beyond friends. I mean, like we've become sisters, right? So there are ways that we show up for each other to celebrate each other's accomplishments. There are ways that we show up when we are in the greatest amount of pain, quite frankly. And it leans on that space of like Black women's camaraderie to really be able to explore things that are difficult. It's a space where we're comfortable being vulnerable with each other. And I think that those are spaces that, you could form those spaces even within, and this is our point. I'm sure that these collectives existed among the enslaved. I'm sure that they exist among the imprisoned, right? Because the reason that we hold on so tightly to pleasure is that no matter what is happening in white supremacy, no matter what is happening in patriarchy, that there is the agency. We don't completely abdicate agency to just be the subject, that there is a way that we can gather together through this vehicle of pleasure to not just survive it, but to combat it and to come up with strategies. So it is a space that I think that it's nice to have a lot of material resources, but I don't know that you absolutely need them.
Okay.
I would absolutely agree. I think some of the most fun that we had as ninjas and work that came out of that play was we would get together on, Shonda Thursdays back in the day, and we were gladiators, mount up, right? And we would get on there, check in, and we'd be tweeting the hell out of scandal, right? And we were very protective of that space, but it formed a system because in reality, it's not like all of us got to see each other that frequently. That convening was kind of a once in a lifetime. I mean, the ninjas as a whole, as a collective, have only been all together for an event once.
Oh, wow.
In person, once. And so it's incredible that we are able to form. That sisterhood did not form because of one event or one in-person thing, that we found these ways, as she said, to show up for each other and to play with each other. And out of that scandal panel, we ended up doing a scandal panel at Duke, right? That those conversations that we were having were exciting for other people to see and join in and think about what kind of collectives they can form. And I've seen incredible, we have a history of Black women forming collectives to do all kinds of work. So why not pleasure? And why not think about ways that you build that into the ethic of care within the circles and communities that you have? And so that to me didn't cost anything, right? To form and to want to play with one another.
Right. Absolutely. I think that one of the joys, that's not to say we've only, we do gather and do scholarly work together a lot over the years, and we've been fortunate enough to do it domestically and internationally. But we just never we've only been able to get us all in the same space like one time. And the fact that no one feels less of a part of that group, I think, is a testimony to that group. But I think that we also are doing an important work of modeling Black feminist praxis, right? We genuinely love and enjoy each other, right? And so I think that, I have a real thing about there are Black feminists who do brilliant theory, but their praxis is just fucked up. You really wonder, do you actually like women, right? And I know you can theorize our oppression, but do you actually like other women? Do you like other femmes? And I think that for us, that pleasure work has also spread its space out to a commitment to model a really genuine and loving praxis, that I know that is important to every single one of us.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for raising that, because I think y'all model Black feminist futurity very beautifully in terms of the praxis piece. So I was thinking about Kimberly Springer's Living for the Revolution, where she tracks the rise and rise of Black feminist organizations such as the Combahee River Collective, right? So she says, despite the best intentions of some of these groups, there is a lack of structural support, a lack of emotional support for Black women showing up in relationship to each other, a lack of even emotional support around acknowledging some people who get put on in certain ways, some people who don't, et cetera, et cetera. So in terms of praxis and a Black feminist love praxis, in bread and butter terms, what does that look like?
I can give you a really good example, right? My chair, jokingly, but not really jokingly, in the brilliant Jennifer Morgan, said to Dr. Lindsey, I don't even know if she was tenured at the time, we were in Italy, and she said, don't think that I don't know that you're her unofficial chair, because Treva reads everything, every single piece of that dissertation before Jennifer, before Jennifer gets it. Or I call her because Jennifer's giving me a comment and I'm like, I have no idea what that means, right? It looks like my bibliography being off in the nth hour before submitting my dissertation. And Dr. Brittany Cooper, who is literally probably one of the busiest people I know, clearing and going, okay, so we're not going to think about the bibliography. I'm just going to like redo the entire bib of like 150 books. You know, it really is about showing up in the ways that you're needed, and also letting people know that you're not alone. I think too many of us feel that we are alone in this work. I think that academia has probably been one of the loneliest spaces that I have encountered, particularly coming into the academy as an artist, right? Who and used to working, you know, I've always had a cohort, you know, creatively. And so I think that I just do think that these things are really, really, really important, and go so far beyond is something a controlling image, you know, like is something a mammy, is something a Jezebel. Like I think that there needs to be an interrogation of representation politics for sure, but also what happens when you only allow yourself to see the work of Black cultural producers through these lenses of these flat representations? What does that do to your own interrogation of trying to understand your own erotic map? How does that fortify your shame if you actually might have something in common with the representation that you are dismissing as a Jezebel, right? What does that do? What conversations does that shut down? You know, so I think that there are real material consequences to having a very narrow and limited lens on how Black women engage their pleasure.
Absolutely. I mean, I will echo that with two things. With the latter point of saying, you know, we come to all of this so often as a battleground. Like everything's a battleground. I can prove that I can critique, I can tear this down, I can deconstruct, I can tell you all of the things that are wrong with it. And I'm like, is this where your pleasure lies? Because that's really sad, right? If that's the place. And that the battle, it's the war, it's the injury, it's the inducting of harm and injury that you're seeking, as opposed to at least approaching it with the possibility of a playground type thing. What if the representations we engage are a playground for us to think through things? And you don't have to like everything on the playground. You may be like, I don't really do the monkey bars, but I really like to slide, right? Like there are ways to have that kind of engagement, and being in a community where a collective where we're all trying to think about the playground first. Right. What's possible here?
Right.
What's unique here? Let's say that this character is having a whole lot of sex, and I know there's going to be all these reads of this person as a Jezebel. What am I missing when I only see explicit sexuality and a commitment to experiencing sexual pleasure as a Jezebel? What does that say about my connection to injury? Absolutely. What does that tell me about my fixation with trauma as an analytic, and in the only analytic? Again, it feels very dehumanizing as a project to only want to render people tropes, representational, kind of flat representational, one-dimensional things without deepening that. And to the former point that Dr. Morgan made, I think, you know, we've all been at a kind of 11th hour moments in our different work, and they phone calls, texts, group chats, FaceTime, smoke signals, whatever it is to get the point across. But it's also in the realest moments, as she said, in the deepest moments of pain that it was. I lost my father a couple of years, about a year and a half ago, and I know the ninjas were there, right? And presence in the hospital, and making me laugh and reminding me of laughter and joy and being in sisterhood and space. And so having that collective, when you said, when we're dealing with so much weight and so much pain, whether personally, structurally, materially, systemically, that there was a collective that was rooted in a love practice that grounded me in that. And that goes far beyond the academy, because it's also a collective. I know if I ever left the academy, or we left the positions that we're in respectively, what's real about this remains. Absolutely. Because the thing that joins it is a commitment to each other and to sisterhood and to practicing love and practice out loud, which is a just practice, right? You can't have justice without that at a communal level, at a societal level, but certainly not at the interpersonal level, and the intimacy that I wanted to have with Black women. I love Black women. in so many ways. And so having a collective that's rooted in that intimacy is not just life affirming, it's life saving.
We love you too. We do. We love you too.
Yes.
So question, you both have engaged different Black feminist pleasure icons, if you will, in your work. So Dr. Morgan, you've written hallmark stuff on lots of different folks, but I'm thinking of Rihanna in your formative piece on pleasure, Dr. Lindsey, in the article that you and Dr. Jessica Marie Johnson beautifully penned, Searching for Climax, you take up Harriet Tubman as a potential icon for Black feminist pleasure. So who were some of the Black feminist pleasure icons that people your imaginaries, and why? So let's turn to representation of it.
That's really interesting. You know, I think that I am inclined to read the pleasure first before I am the problem, right? So, like, since Treva brought up Scandal, right? Liv she's a mess. She's a hot mess, right? She's a mess that, like, sometimes we even are like, okay, I'm just done with Liv. Like, she needs some Black girlfriends.
Yeah.
But
Oh, she needed.
Do I love the fact that, like, she has really messy sex in the closet in the church? Yes, I do. Right? So I think that, you know, the point for me is not like, who are the kind of aspirational pleasure people, right? Like Beyonce, I have 2 chapters on her in a dissertation about her pleasure engagements. But I think to position her as aspirational becomes difficult, right? Because we can't all be Beyonce, right? So it's really about, like, connecting to what is it that Beyonce does that makes me, that is liberatory for me, that I can apply into, like, my own life and my own practice. So, like, I'm never gonna have Rihanna's legs that go on forever, right? And, like, just look amazing in every single practically naked photo shoot that she does. But what I do have in common with her, really do give less than 2 fucks about a whole lot of things, right? So that for me is, like, really a useful part of my pleasure practice. So I think what I try to do in the work is to find the places. I'll give you another example. There is, I get a lot of pleasure out of reading Toni Morrison, and especially early Toni Morrison, because of the craft of her writing, even when the subject matter is really difficult, right? Mm-hmm. But what I emulate is that beautiful picture of braless Toni on the dance floor, just leaving it all out there, right? Sweating like she just don't care. And so I think that, you know, I don't want to read those 2 things in contradiction. I don't want to read the author who wrote Beloved and the woman who was on the dance floor, as somehow in contention or negation of each other.
Absolutely.
Yes. Braless Toni, an image and a romance, right? And that's just what we got the image of. So I know if we got an image of it, it's so much more beyond the image, right? And down and wanting to have these parties, and I too think about that. I probably have, if you got 2, like -2 to give, I might have like -1. I'm still working on that, honestly. And being with the pleasure ninjas has decreased my fucks to give ratio, right. In terms of doing that. But I think about a show I loved, for instance, Survivor's Remorse, which was canceled on Star. And one of the things I loved about the show was, one, the character played by Tashina Arnold, who's the mother of the main character, the basketball player. At one point, she decides to get a vaginal rejuvenation because she's having all of this sex now, and she's having it with this billionaire who is the shoe mogul of the Bow shoes, this fictional Bow shoes, the equivalent of Nike in China. And so it also took 2 framings of sexuality that in many ways have been demonized and fetishized in different ways as negative in society. An Asian American man, and in this case, just an Asian man, and a Black woman, dark-skinned Black, who comes from very humble beginnings, and they are having sex, and they are talking about sex, and they are engaged in sex. And she's talking to her son like, I want this vaginal rejuvenation because I want pleasure. And I was like, wow, I have not really seen this. And she's, you know, she's a mother. She is someone who's supposed to be protective and this, and it just completely blows that out. And her daughter is representing on TV this queer woman of color, right? This queer Black woman who is having all kinds of different sexual engagements with different women, right? She is absolutely committed to casual encounters and not knowing the names of the women that she's engaging with. And then you have another character that's married to her husband, but they're talking about having sex every other minute, right? So you got these three wide-ranging kind of representations of what that looked like. And it's one of the reasons I love the show, even though the show was centered on essentially men, that it really brought in to think about all of these different ways that Black female sexuality can exist in the world and be unapologetically and unabashedly so, which doesn't mean you're not thinking about or talking about these things and being self-reflexive, but that pleasure is a central way of doing that. And so I'm always on the lookout for those kinds of representations, not necessarily the most obvious ones that we see, but the ways that really play to the various ways that Black women explore pleasure and sexuality. And if we're talking about this, I'm almost certain our ancestors were in different ways, even under a different set of circumstances, which is why I meant to look back at Harriet Tubman or Mary Church Terrell or Ida B. Wells and find them sneaking off to dance at certain things and move their hips, or being out in the woods with so-and-so and all of that. It's in their records. We are choosing what we want to tell about their stories, and they are choosing what they want to tell us about their lives. But the inner lives and interior lives of Black women, Black femmes is complex and rich, and usually has a pleasure politic, even if it's one that's muffled and they've been told to suppress that politics. And so we interrogate that, and we're hopefully creating space for people to think through the different ways that that's been suppressed for Black women and femmes, and girls for that matter.
And I think that one of the dangers of what happens when we don't take Black women's pleasure seriously, right, is that the analysis that Dr. Lindsey just gave you about survivor's remorse, I've seen nothing written about that show. I've seen absolutely nothing written about V's character in Shameless, who is a beautiful Black woman married to this absolutely gorgeous but not too bright white guy, right? Who thinks that she is like, you know, an absolute goddess, right? And they are incredibly sexual. And like everyone on that show has sex in all kind of ways that most people would think at some point is inappropriate, right? Regardless of race. And there's a real, you know, and they're classed in a particular way, and they're complicated, and they challenge us. And those are the pieces that don't get written because they don't fall easily into the category of controlling images. And so the work and the characters that we actually want to see being created are being done a disservice because they completely fall out of the conversation of Black feminist cultural critique.
That's it. It falls out. And I was wondering, I was waiting for someone, because I'm still waiting for the letter campaign. It's like, can we bring that show back? It just did a lot of work around pleasure, and it wasn't centered. And I think about when Jessica Marie Johnson and I wrote that piece about Harriet Tubman, in addition to thinking about slavery and sexuality, we also want to think about it is a disabled Black woman who is accessing pleasure, right? So she's at a few spaces at which we tend to negate and evacuate pleasure from people with disabilities, from Black people, from Black women specifically, right? And she falls at this intersection of ableism, anti-Black racism, and sexism and heteropatriarchy that's telling her you should not marry a man more than 10 years younger than you are. Right? And Harriet's like, oh, boo. I just led this biggest military strike ever, planned by a woman in history, liberated, all this work, still fighting, and you gonna tell me who I can and cannot be with? And then you're gonna write that out of the narrative about me in favor of presenting this heroine who never felt herself, who never touched herself, who never was touched by anyone. She deserves better than that, right? She deserves more than being an icon or a Google Doodle or on the $20 bill, right? It is so much more than that. And Black women's sexuality deserves so much more than we're willing to give. And its complexities and the stickiness, the wetness, the feel, the smell, as you mentioned when you started with the taste, all of that. These are the analytics that we need if we're going to take Black women's lives seriously. If you're not taking pleasure seriously, you're not taking our lives seriously.
Absolutely. I mean, so you both have spoken to analytics such as controlling images, which have inhibited the possibility of reading and mining the extant archives of Black feminist pleasure. Could y'all say a bit more about what you see as some of the social, political, economic impediments to and possibilities for feminist, Black femme, Black girl, Black women's pleasure, historically, contemporarily, but we could focus it on now, you know, when we're under global duress. So pandemic, right? The millionth iteration of Black Lives Matter, right? So people forced into the home if they have housing, right? Forced online for sociality. What are we doing right now? Black feminist pleasure. I mean, even possibility models. I'm thinking about entities and movements, formations such as the Nat Ministry.
Yeah, I'm interested in what Dr. Lindsey has to say. Like, pleasure's difficult for me, I would say right now. I am, you know, 2020 really stressed me out, as it did with most people. And I think that I'm physically dealing with the challenges of what 2020 has done with our bodies. You know, being home, not working ergonomically correctly, nursing various kind of like I'm in physical therapy, like, you know, which a lot of us either are or should be or will be at the end of this period of our time. I'm particularly private about my home. I hate the invasion of the camera as a lens mandatorily into my home. No offense, y'all, but you know what I mean? Like, I'm sick of having people in my living room. The mandatory isolation of being responsible about COVID and safety practices means that I've had to engage spaces actually that I probably wouldn't have thought about engaging before for connection and companionship. So I find this period really challenging. I find it everyone I know, quite frankly, is smoking weed. You know, like, weed has made a terrific comeback because everyone is really, like, you know, stressed out. So I guess, Dr. Roach, what I'm saying is that when I think about, like, your question, I wish I had an answer that didn't seem as small as, like, girl, I'm just trying to get through the next day. Like, I'm just trying to get through the next day.
Put it in a question. I'm like, pleasure's feeling hella hard right now. So, you know, I'm trying to mine your archives and imaginations. What are you?
I mean, I think that's it. I think I'm in a similar boat. I remain committed to it. I think my sisterhood practice has intensified how we check in. You know, the most FaceTiming, Zooming I've done. I do once a month happy hours with my girls from middle school and high school, which wasn't happening pre-pandemic, to connect and check in. A whole lot of Netflix from like around the globe and seeing other ways of thinking about the world. I love all these TikTok challenges and watching them and watching people create them. And so many of them are created by Black girls, right? I mean, you might get to them once they're by like a white social media person, but you can always tell when it's a Black girl, okay? Absolutely. And so seeing all of that and that creativity and that energy reminds me, even as someone who's like not doing the challenges because my knees ain't what they used to be, but watching that transition, like I was joking with a friend the other day, like everything is all arms these days with the way kids are dancing. So even mining what it means that during the pandemic, we're like here up. And so it's interesting see choreography that is so
Yeah.
largely about visible on like a Zoom screen. And I get pleasure from thinking through that, but like just witnessing it first. And I think that a connection, you know, yes, you know, alcohol has been nice. Little glass of wine here, Black Girl Room today. I've had more happy hours, I think, this year than I've had the last 5. And, you know, just to keep it all the way real, you know, sex toys are great. And for a range of ways of touch and connection. And I think it's expanded the way I think about touch and my need for touch. I consider myself someone who doesn't need a lot of touch. As the ninjas know, I'm not a hugger. That Dr. Cooper and I are the 2 non-huggers in the ninjas. And yet, you know, I've been craving being held. I hate saying this online because I feel like anybody who knows me is gonna hug me when they see me when outside opens back up. But I do crave that, and finding ways to create touch, whether sexually or just intimately, has been really important for feeling connected in a world that is so incredible. And I noticed a question over here from the chat about recovering post-pleasure, like post-COVID, recovering pleasure. I think my pleasure commitment is going to be on like 10 of thinking about that and wanting that intimate engagement with people because of its importance and understanding its importance. And, you know, to be real, not to bring the mood down, you know, we're talking about 450,000 lives lost. There's a lot of touch that needs to happen when we can reach into the world, because the ways that we grieve and we mourn and we engage one another in spaces of loss has been irreparably affected by this. Our world has been irrevocably affected by this. And so I think the patterns and push of intimacy will be so important post-COVID as we work through healing. There are not going to be enough therapists, enough healers, enough of the resources that we need to really get over the kind of mass grief that's still unfolding. And so I think intimate practices of touch in many ways, not just physical, but touching out and intimacy with people is going to be one of our recovery strategies. And I hope people look to Black feminist tools like the NAP Ministry, like Adrienne Marie Brown and work around pleasure activism, around stuff that, you know, the pleasure ninjas in different ways are articulating to find strategies for fostering intimacy post-COVID, because we're going to need it. We're going to need it to survive. Like, we need stuff to survive right now, but post-COVID survival is something distinct too.
Absolutely.
I think that it's also an opportunity to reinterrogate some of our pleasure practices. I'll be really honest, as someone who is Caribbean born and Jamaican specifically, and a traveler. Like, I really don't ever unpack a suitcase, right? Like, I realized during COVID that one of my ways of dealing with the US's bullshit is just to leave all the time. I pretty much live my life like a moving target. And COVID prohibits that. But, you know, I also have the feeling, you know, I'm also watching friends post their COVID vacations in places like Accra, maskless, right? When I'm on the phone with a woman who is like my sister, who I know is not going out, is not going to any of those places, who lives in a country where if you cannot go and fly yourself to London on even outside of COVID and the pandemic, you will very likely die if your only option is Accra's like medical system, right? So whose mother from Thanksgiving to present day can't get out of bed because she's lost 5 friends to COVID. It does something to me to see my US friends turning up in West Africa like it's all good and there's no COVID. It does something to me as a Jamaican to see you lounging in the beach in Montego Bay, in the grill, maskless, living your best life, when my family members are struggling to survive COVID. And so I hope in this moment that we reinterrogate the practices that we have, our pleasure practices, our privileges, as people who are in the United States and understand that they do not extend necessarily to other people of color, to other Black people throughout the diaspora.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for that.
Like that pleasure and the colonizing practices of pleasure ain't where it is, right? And there's something very colonizing in terms of behavior that comes along with that. And as someone who, like Dr. Morgan, is on a plane every week, if I can, to be somewhere and to be with her. You know, this is the longest stretch we probably haven't seen each other in quite some time. So to see people, I'm someone like, if I want to see you, I will hop on a plane and get there and hang out, because that is intimacy to me and connected. And as COVID has shown us, you know, the fleetingness of like someone's here today, gone tomorrow, and that's shown up in a lot of different ways, whether that's police violence, the enduring rate of anti-Blackness, if that is a pandemic, if that is all pre-existing condition, all of these things have become magnified for me. And so to see people practicing what they would consider pleasure amidst that, without any consideration for without what it considers in terms of the trauma and injury that you bring so many other people, is hard to watch. I mean, it's made me reevaluate relationships. It's made me reevaluate how I think about how I'm going to handle those intimacies post-COVID.
Absolutely.
Because it's not, being self-possessed and being colonizingly selfish are very different.
Absolutely.
Are very different practices.
And I wish we could get into that distinction. It's really rich, theoretically, politically, erotically, but we're just about at time. So Dr. Morgan, Dr. Lindsey, would you like to say a final word to our audience?
Yes, I would. I want to thank everybody for coming, first of all. I didn't do that in the beginning, but, you know, this is just a time where I think I'd like to encourage everyone to think about, not necessarily thinking about pleasure as our optimum, but just really engaging a practice of self-care and being gentle with yourselves. Exercise your right to say no, understand that there is something absolutely once in a lifetime, once in a century going on, and that your productivity doesn't have to look like when those events are not going on. And just like, let's just be kind to yourselves and be kind to each other.
I echo Dr. Morgan that being kind and being gentle is something we remind ourselves. It's something that she reminds me quite often. It's very easy to be hard on ourselves in a world that is already extremely hard on us. A reminder of that. And I would just say, for me, something we didn't get to talk about a lot, and I saw it in the questions, was thinking about Black girls and pleasure. And really in this moment when we have 9-year-old girls getting pepper sprayed by police and telling them to stop acting like a child, that creating spaces in which Black girls get to explore their bodies, explore their pleasure, to be loud, to be creative, to be fun, that we create the brave spaces in which that happens, because we know that the world is not a brave space for them, and they'll be punished in various ways for showing up as their Black girl selves. So I feel it incumbent upon those of us who are Black women and femmes to really create spaces for Black girls to be able to experience pleasure, to be affirmed in their right to pleasure as a space. And I think that really pushes back against the adultification, that pushes back against the trauma that they experience moving and navigating through the world. So Black girls got a right to pleasure too. So stop shaming them, stop blaming them, and let's create space for them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Drs. Lindsey and Morgan. You're brilliant, beautiful, and amazing. I want to remind folks to check out the rest of the films and programs for Black History Month at mkefilm.org/BHM. Take care and have a good night, everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.
Part of what I think is so important about celebrating commemorative months like Black History Month is that they act as the beginning of the conversation, not the end. This is a great way to get people engaged around really important issues and interests within the Black community. I think people are going to be really impressed with the diversity of films and events and the ease of access. We've worked really hard to make this a really accessible program. All of our events will be available on our MKE Film Facebook page, our Black Lens Facebook page, and our MKE Film YouTube page. So you can go to either of those pages and watch events for free. Our films will be available on our watchmkefilm.org page from February 1st through February 28th.